What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend of debrief in an effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts for today, Caleb Pearson. Joining me on the host spotlight, Miss Emma Culler. Emma, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here. He's in the pulpit this weekend, I think again next weekend as well, helping us dive into our Mark series. Pastor Mark, how are you? Good. Thanks for being here. Let's jump into a Sunday in review. This whole idea of following Jesus. Tim set the stage as we discovered a little bit about the author, and then Mark took us through a handful of passages in chapter 1. But Emma, I'd love to come your way. What stood out from the service, let alone the passage, and then we'll see what Mark has for us.
So I really appreciated how you walked through just an overview of the book of Mark, and what really stood out to me was the purpose statement, and I wrote that down. Mark wrote to help transform us into faith-filled followers of Jesus Christ by emphasizing that the one we follow is the divine Son of God who became the suffering Son of Man who died and rose again in triumph. And I'm really excited to see that unpacked as we dive into the book.
I think it helps to understand who the author is the first week, and then the second week take some time to understand what the whole book's going to do before we actually even read a singular verse. It sets some sound Bible study methods, I think, so that the deeper we go in, the more it affirms what we've already said.
Right. And we'll come back to that because it's good to model good Bible study and understand contexts. And Mark is interesting. And Tim brought this out too, that there's no genealogy of Jesus. There's a lot of stuff that is missing. And scholars talk about when they analyze the gospel accounts in the life of Christ, they see it in kind of three stages. There's the year of what they call the year of obscurity, the year of popularity, and then the year of oppression or attack. So what's missing is the year of obscurity. There's nothing about Jesus growing up, going to the temple, his birth narratives, what happened during the 30 years. Of course, most of the Gospels don't do that. It picks up, as we'll see in verse 14, he's in Galilee, and he's what Luke includes, which is interesting, is some of that a little bit of that beginning, because he gives the birth narratives and all that. But then the John the Baptist baptism, Luke talks more about that, as does John in his writings. And not much is said about Jesus. He's back in Galilee, but we know that Jesus had been in Jerusalem, or in that Judea, being baptized. Mark begins with the year of prosperity, or the where he's up and good things are happening. Got a lot of response, and people are awed, and but the opposition, he weaves that in a lot, and we'll see as we go into Gospel of Mark. I mean, it doesn't take long before the religious leaders are already attacking him, plotting against him. The other thing about the Gospels that's also interesting is the weight that they give to the to the crucifixion and the final week and leading up to that. Matthew's Gospel, wrote down here. Matthew's Gospel.
I think you said it in the service, or the percentage.
The percentage
I'm trying to remember what you mentioned.
Well, but this has to do with the Passion Week, where 43%, what I said in the sermon, was the words of Jesus.
Right.
That there was, but what's devoted to the Passion Week in Matthew, 43% of his, so 12 out of 28 chapters, 12 out of 28 focus on that. John's Gospel is the most. Over half of John's Gospel, 11 chapters out of 21 chapters are devoted to the Passion Week. Luke's the smallest, only 6 out of 24, so about 25%. Mark gives 6 out of 16. So over 37% of Mark's Gospels. So all the Gospel writers, big chunk of what they're writing, which shows all of them that is it all
building.
It all builds, and that is the main focus: the death and resurrection of Christ, which is the gospel.
Right.
That is the good news that Jesus died and rose again. So everything points to that. So we'll see a lot of that in Mark as well.
And I think that speaks to why it's so easy to study the Gospels, maybe offhanded or visit a couple of them when it comes to the passages. Like, I think it's probably easy to focus on maybe a topical sermon series or a different passage in the New Testament. And then when it comes to understanding Jesus, pick a gospel and then you just kind of cite it. Maybe it's Matthew. Oh, they all talk about the same thing. It's all that same story. But the way we're going to own and understand one of the Gospels and understand why it's different than the other ones. I think that's so important.
Yes.
Again, there are theological narratives that each author had a particular point and purpose that he was writing. We want to
and I think this is
that.
potentially one of the forgotten Gospels because it's shorter. It maybe misses some things here and there. You could find more detail on certain things in the other books.
True.
But the color, and I appreciate the vividness, the other books lack sometimes. And so I think it'll raise the value of this. I mean, it's profitable scripture, but...
I mentioned also that only about 50 days of Christ's life, of his 30 plus, maybe 37 years on earth, only 50 days are recorded in the combined gospel accounts. Now that would be interesting to see how much of those 50 days, what percentage did Mark write about, or did Matt? I'm not sure about that, but
and it doesn't feel like that. It's not even 2 months.
Yeah,
but we read it like it's
his
dull,
entire life.
boring. His entire life,
the life of Christ, and
drawn
the gospel.
out.
No, it's not.
Right.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah. Think of all the things. Well, John said in John, he said many other signs Jesus did that are not written in this book, but I've written these. Think of all the things that was left on the cutting floor, in a sense, by divine inspiration that we don't know. The stories that we don't know that we'll probably know once we get to heaven and hear those stories. There's a whole lot that happen that we don't know about.
Right.
So jumping into Mark chapter 1 then, obviously we're focusing on John the Baptist. I appreciated the 5 elements of the fulfillment: John's location, his appearance, his message, his impact, and his humility. What part of sermon prep was that going to be of value compared to going to some of the Old Testament passages? Is there anything you want to expand on as far as the prophecy?
Well, and I will next week.
Yeah. Good.
Just in terms of the message, the messaging of John the Baptist in the wilderness. And there's some really cool things, but I'll bring that up this weekend sermon if I have time. But there's some really, really cool things.
Because we're spending multiple weeks on the prologue, effectively.
Right,
Yeah.
three weeks on those first 13 verses. But the obviously for Mark, it was significant. He gives his opening statement, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Kind of, okay. What does he do right away after that? He talks about the voice, verse 2 and 3, and Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3 and 4. So he draws our attention right away there, and the importance of how this is fulfilling Scripture, and the whole idea that struck me, and I didn't bring this out. It would have been a great application to talk about, but that's what the sermon podcast is for. Is the divine sovereign hand of God. This was planned by God.
Yeah.
John came on the scene right. Paul writes, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his. At the right time in human history, all this is orchestrated by God. And what I find interesting in Isaiah, when I went back to some old notes in Isaiah, in the sermon series we did, whenever, it was a long time ago. 6 years ago. That is one of the main emphasis. You see it all over is the sovereign hand of God. He's going to bring the Assyrians. He's going to send those people off to Babylon one day. And then in chapter 41, he's going to bring Cyrus. Listen to me in silence. Let the peoples gain new strength. Let them come forward. Let them speak. Let them come together for judgment. Who has aroused one from the east, whom he calls in righteousness to his feet? He delivers up nations before him and subdues kings. He makes them like dust. And it goes on, and it will actually name Cyrus. The Persian is going to come. Well, again, the people, worldly secular scholars of the Old Testament will look at that and says, well, obviously that must have been written after the fact, because they don't want to believe that God could predict it, an outcome. And so that's exactly what happened. Isaiah writes that decades, 100 plus years, hundreds of years before Cyrus actually comes. Well, he also wrote about John the Baptist centuries before he came on the scene. And I just found that intriguing. And that's kind of stuff that theologians like to get their mind blown over, that God had predicted and foreordained this. Yeah. And John comes on the scene, and yet John, there's this uneasy tension between the sovereign ordination of God, the providence of God, and humans' responsibility and that will of them. He and yet,
right.
And he must have known. Right. John must have known that he was the fulfillment of this. And how cool would that be to know that I've been raised up by God?
Yeah.
And I just think that's pretty neat.
Well, it's interesting too that Mark, we've talked about that it omits the genealogies that some of the other Gospels cling to, but it still, in the first couple of verses, communicates the same message, and that is that Jesus fits. He fits into what has come before, because the genealogies are doing that. Here are all these people, here's the humanity of Christ, and it's just cool that Mark's not going to maybe list all that, but he will right away say, see how this fits into the Old Testament. So it's just a cool, totally different text. A that's the boring stuff I'd skip over my whole young adult life. The genealogy of Christ, here we go. Skim through it. But it's demonstrating the intentionality of God through all these people in this lineage. He fits. Here it is again. Not only does Jesus fit, but the guy who precedes him fits, and there's prophecies about him. That has really opened my eyes as I study prophecy and more of Scripture. I realized, okay, God was prophetic over way more than just his son. I grew up thinking prophecy was this one dimensional. Okay, we get it. God's just teasing his son. Prophecy about Jesus. Prophecy about Jesus. There was intricate, small little prophecies. All of it is God just demonstrating. This is all orchestrated.
And what I like about Isaiah, after giving some of that prophecy, or in the midst of it, and that future foretelling, in Isaiah 40, he kind of continues with these, and they're words of encouragement in a way. He says in verse 12, so who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens by the span, who's calculated the dust of the earth by the measure, and weighted the mountains in the balance, and the hills in a pair of scales? Who's directed the Spirit of the Lord? Or who has, or as his counselor has informed him? With whom did he consult, and who gave him understanding? Who taught him in the path of justice, and taught him in knowledge, and informed him of the way of understanding? And he goes on, and he'll say in verse 27 of Isaiah, so why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God? There they are off in Babylon captivity. There are the Jews of the struggling first century under Roman oppression. Here are people today, even God's people, wondering, where are you, God? And he said, why do you say, O Jacob, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God? And he goes on and says, and this is one of my favorite passages of all Scripture, do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, Jehovah, the creator of the ends of the earth, he does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary. To him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary And tired and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait upon the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings. It doesn't say chiefs. It says like eagles. And they will run and not get tired, and they will walk and not.
So we should have known.
Yeah. I could have talked about this in my sermon too, but I just thought,
Don't give
Lukens
the satisfaction.
No, or Mike Thomas or any Eagles fans. They would have heard that, and that I would have lost them the rest of the sermon. So I avoided that.
That's good.
Yeah.
But here is God telling. Here's God telling people, this is what's going to happen. A voice is coming to prepare the way of the Word, and don't you for a second worry that it's not going to happen, because I'm God, and I make these things happen, and I will orchestrate your life and Zacharias and Elizabeth's, and in their old age, and they'll have a son, and he'll be called John, and all this is it's very humbling. It makes me feel kind of like, who am I? But that's all that background in Isaiah is so cool.
Right. Well, and I think that's the question for you and I, Emma, is how is this going to help us understand following Jesus? How is it going to help us appreciate that? What is it about? Even hearing the Rodriguez story in the service this past weekend, did you find that encouraging? Are you excited about this study? What is it about following Jesus that you hope to accomplish over the next several weeks?
Well, kind of tying into what we were just talking about is how God is meeting people where we're at. So you said in the sermon that Mark's gospel is primarily written to Roman believers, so it's not Jewish. So it doesn't have that Jewish genealogy. But he starts off with saying, this is from God. This is what God has ordained. And so the Romans didn't have that context for all those names. But he's starting and saying, no, look, this is what God ordained. And just starting off with that. And I think that's so incredible, is right out of the gate. It's like, no, this is what God is doing. And just that refocusing of, okay, who is actually in control, who is actually in charge. And I'm really excited to see how that plays out, because we can identify with that. We're not from Jewish backgrounds. And so I think that's really, really cool.
Yeah. As we're not the Romans. And so Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. And this is all couched historically in Judaism and all of that. Christianity is born out of that. So you can't understand unless you give some background. It's interesting how little some of it Mark does write and give that background.
Yeah.
But I just love the way Mark wrote, as he selectively put some of these things out, knowing that the people he's writing to may not have had a broad context, but he told us enough. And what he's calling us to is to follow the one who is the divine Son of God, who became the suffering Son of Man. He is the mighty Messiah and the suffering servant, and that we can trust him. And it's this discipleship call. And I think as he concluded in the 15th chapter of Jesus on the cross, and I mentioned this, if a Roman centurion could look up
caught onto
a dead man on a Roman crucifixion stake and say, surely this was the Son of God. And then the very next chapter, the very next verses, is the resurrection to life. That's pretty powerful. So it's that call to follow him. Yeah, and we're going to have those little testimonies in the bumper video as much as we can throughout this series of people just giving little testimonies to what it means in that little part of their life to follow Christ.
Just like Mark writes, vivid picture. That's the hope for those testimonials as well.
Another thing I did want to bring out is as we follow Christ, and as Mark unfolds this, and Tim also mentioned there will be many failures listed by the disciples, kind of things not to do in discipleship. But I think Mark is also trying to build our confidence in following Jesus, the Son of God, who's the mighty Messiah. We can suffer with him as we go through this world, because he was the mighty God who became the suffering servant, and he calls us into that. But and this is just a big, broad picture. I was actually talking with someone after the first service about this, how you can't understand human history apart from understanding these great kind of epochs, movements of God, the times and the seasons that God has ordained and fixed, and as well as seeing mankind's depravity and fallenness in all of that. With the Mark will bring it out with the Romans and with the failures of the disciples, and we were having this conversation in the hallway, and it just kind of, we were mutually talking about how it grieves us that in our education, our secular education, people are trying to learn history. And I was a history major at college, and people trying to understand history apart from a theology. You can't do it.
No.
You can't do it. So we have generations of children growing up not understanding history in light of the movements of God that have ordained things. And it's in another life, if I had another life or lived for another 100 years, I would love to see local churches develop curriculums. And they're homeschooling curriculums, but I'm not familiar with what they teach and how they teach history. But I would love to see embedded or incorporated into local church teaching ministry a perspective of the unfolding drama of from creation to Christ and to our present day, the movements of all, and see history in light of.
Well, then it's not
God.
then it's not bifurcated. How there's biblical history, but I have a world history test next week. I got to study for that.
That's right.
I can't go to youth group. I got a history test, or it's different, but it shouldn't be.
And I don't know if we're training the next generation to understand what's going on in human history, what's going on. In our last election, what's happening, unfolding now, as if that, like you were saying, that's on one plane, and then we go to church and Sunday school and we hear, okay, David and Goliath or some others, the Bible stories, and how can we incorporate a biblical
And if a teenager can connect those dots, they'll be more likely to keep connecting them in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
But if they never connect them once and they hit 18 years old, that's an uphill climb until they're 30.
When I was pastoring that little church in Nebraska, those first 9 years in ministry, because I enjoy history so much, and I had 2 years of church history at Dallas Seminary, taught by wonderful church historians, I did a midweek Bible study for a year on church history. So, and with these older people, and they'd come out on Thursday night. Well, these people, they grew up and we're talking about 70, 80-year-old people, some 90-year-old people at that time in the 80s. I mean, they were born at the end of the last century, some of them, and they were taught, it was like the way they were educated was a little different, and they loved this history class. And they filled their notebooks. It was so much fun to see these elderly people taking notes, asking questions as we went through the church history. I just, in another life, I wish I could do that, but because I think it's missing. I think it's missing. I think you're right, we bifurcate here's the church Bible stories, and then we go to school or whatever, and we hear about world history.
So you heard it here first. Emma's going to write a cover-to-cover biblical history textbook for all your kids.
There you go.
Yeah, excited for next week and for the Book of Mark to continue.
The baptism of Jesus.
Yep, absolutely. Emma, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You're awesome. Mark, appreciate it, brother.
Yep.
As a reminder to our listeners and viewers, remember that you can find us at fbcva.org/podcasts. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to just take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.